We are returning to our study of the book of Ecclesiastes. In the previous two lessons, well, let me go back and just say about what we have seen in Ecclesiastes so far. Solomon is doing an examination of life. And it's a very realistic examination that he says there's a lot of things that are not good. And then there's a lot of things that no matter what you do, you're still going to die. And death becomes the great leveler, even if you're good or even if you're bad. And he kind of takes that and it becomes a little bit of despair, but then he leads it to say that God has given man the gift of life and he's given man the gift of labor, and a person should enjoy that which God has given in the time that he has. And then, speaking of time, when we came to chapter 3, he went into that famous passage that talks about there's a time for all things and its purpose under heaven, a time to be born, a time to die, and all of these various things, a time of war, a time for peace, a time for laughing, and a time for mourning. And the point Solomon is making is not that, well, that's just the way the ball bounces sometimes. It goes against you and it comes your way sometimes. That was not the point. The point was that God has made everything in its time, and that God is the controller of the times. So therefore, we should live in a way that honors him in those times. And when the last video that we did, he talked about, he applied that to your labor. He says, enjoy the time God has given you. And went on to say this, he said, he has made everything beautiful in its time. And he says, and he has put eternity into man's heart. But then he goes on to say, yet so that man cannot discover and know what God has done from the beginning to end. So we go forward in this life in which God controls our times, and we have opportunities to enjoy the life we've given. And he says that's what we should do. Now, when we come to the lesson today, we're going to begin with verse 16 of chapter 3. We're going to go a little bit into chapter 4. And he's going to stay on this idea about time, but he's also going to show there are negative things that go on here. There are bad things in this world, and we would acknowledge that that is true. So let's look at what he says here. When we go to verse 16, he says, moreover, I saw under the sun that in the place of justice, even there was wickedness, and in the place of righteousness, even there was wickedness. So he's just looking at the world realistically. He says, I look and I say, in the place where there should be justice. And he's probably talking about the law courts and things that decide, the judges. In those places where justice should be exercised, he said, there was wickedness. I think we can relate to that oftentimes justice is not done. And sometimes there is corruption and justice. You saw in the Bible where they condemned bribery as we condemn it today, because people would bribe judges to get the decision they wanted. And people do that today. And so he said, in the place where there should be justice, there is wickedness. And he goes on to say, and in the place of righteousness, even there was wickedness. Now I take this when he says in the place of righteousness, in religious areas, places where people should be righteous. Maybe in, we would say in our modern age, in the church or in religious matters. There should be righteousness there. There should be doing right there. But we don't always see that. Sometimes we see wickedness. Sometimes we see deception. Sometimes we see people trying to profit from deceiving others. So Solomon's just giving us a realistic view of the world and a realistic view that we ourselves have witnessed. And he goes on to say in verse 17, and I said in my heart, God will judge the righteous and the wicked, for there is a time for every matter and for every work. So once again, he goes back to this time of all things. There's wickedness where it should not be. And God's going to judge it. Because God is righteous. And that's the assumption. He doesn't say that, but he assumes that because God is righteous. God's going to judge it. And he said there's a time for these things. And there's a time that there will be a time for judgment. So that's a comfort to those of us who see wickedness and say, why is the world the way it is? It was a comfort for those in Solomon's day who saw wickedness and said, why is there not something to be done? But he said, God will judge it in his time. Now, the question that's kind of hanging there then, why didn't he do it now? Why is there wickedness in the world and he is not judging? Because we can say that God does not always immediately judge wickedness. Well, Solomon addresses that. And he goes to verse 18. I said in my heart with regard to the children of man that God is testing them, that they may see that they themselves are but beasts. Beasts. He said, so God has a purpose in not judging immediately. For one, he allows the wicked to convict themselves. He allows the wicked to demonstrate their utter wickedness and let others see their wickedness. And that in itself is a judgment. So he says God has a purpose in that. And that's another underlying theme here. It goes back to the times. God has a purpose in how he does things. This is an underlying theme in the entire Bible of God's sovereignty over all things and God's control over all things. If God is not sovereign, if God is not controlling all things, he's the most frustrated being in the universe. So even wickedness is allowed by God for God's purposes. We can't always know what those purposes are. And we trust him. And so Solomon says God has a purpose for why he has not judged. He's demonstrated in letting men show themselves to be the beasts that they are. And he says in verse 19, for what happens to the children of man and what happens to the beasts is the same. As one dies, so dies the other. So he goes back to that, to take off on that men are just beasts. They're just animals. They're brute animals, in other words. He says, just like the beast dies, the man dies. Now, that gives us some little problems. Solomon is not arguing an evolutionary view that says man or mankind are not a unique creation of God. He certainly did not believe that. That is not in the Hebrew worldview from which he is writing. Not at all. The point he is making is the fragility of life. He said, the beasts die and we die. And so life demonstrates to us that life on this earth, which is Solomon's main focus, that life on this earth is not permanent. None of us lives forever. And Solomon is clear about that. He's said it before. Death is the great leveler. So he says, as the one dies, so dies the other, the beast and the man. He says they all have the same breath. And man has no advantage over the beasts, for all is vanity. Now, once again, he says the man has the breath of life in him just as the beasts do. The beasts die, and so the man dies. Once again, he's not equating in value. He's not saying that they're equal to man, but he's saying the what happens on this earth is very similar. And then he says in verse 20 something that's a little strange for us as New Testament Christians. Verse 20, he says, all go to one place, all are from the dust, and to dust all return. He says everybody dies and goes to the same place. And what he means here is the grave, because he says all go to the dust. Everybody goes to the dust. Everyone is buried. That's the fate for everyone, if I might use that term, in this world. And he goes on in verse 21. He says, who knows whether the spirit of man goes upward and the spirit of the beast goes down into the earth. Now, that is strange for us because we say, well, we know what happens. Well, understand, first of all, the Hebrews had a less developed understanding of what happens after death. And there are scholars who have written about this. One of the best writings I've seen on this is by the Old Testament scholar Daniel Block, where he talked about the Old Testament view of hell. And it's a great article. And I will tell you where, I'll put the reference on the screen. And so there was a less developed view of what happens after life. The Hebrews knew that when someone died, they went to Sheol, which was the place of the dead. Now, generally speaking, in the Old Testament, there was the belief that those who do good are better off in Sheol, and those who do badly are in a worse place. But that was the Old Testament view. And really, it comes into the New Testament also. We talk about Abraham's bosom and paradise, and there are many who think that that's a New Testament version of the Old Testament view of Sheol, and then Christ liberates his people from that, his righteous, after his death, burial, and resurrection. We won't go into that here. But my point is the Hebrew view of the afterlife was somewhat undeveloped. And it was in the process of being developed. And so he says, I'll go to one place. Who knows whether the spirit of man goes upward or the spirit of the beast goes down into the earth? It's kind of like, well, who knows? And the point being is that this life was really important. And what we do in this life is really important. Now, we would understand better being in a New Testament viewpoint that, yes, the rich man and Lazarus, the rich man lifted up his eyes in Hades. And so there is a reward. There are punishments. There are consequences to how we live. And Solomon would not deny that, because at the end of the book, he's going to tell you God will bring you into judgment for what you do, good or bad. So God's sovereignty and God's judgment over all things is an undercurrent in this book, but his focus is upon living this life. And really, when we sum this up, he says, since we're going to die, and since there's wickedness in this earth that God will eventually judge, how should we live? And he's going to give it to us in verse 22. So I saw that there's nothing better than that a man should rejoice in his work, for that is his lot. He says, goes back to that theme, his answer to these questions in the book of Ecclesiastes that you can't answer. What do we do with the futility of life? What do we do with the fact that life is circular? What do we do with the fact that no matter how hard I work, I'm eventually going to die and leave it to someone else? He says, enjoy what God has given you and see it as it being from the hand of God. He said that is his lot. That is that which has been allotted to him. Allotted by God. And then he says at the very last phrase here, who can bring him to see what will be after him? We don't know what will be after us. We don't know what's going to come after us. We don't, in our lives today, the time of our life will come to an end. And we will leave some things, and we will hopefully have friends and family that we leave, but we don't know what will happen after us. So he says, live in this time. Doesn't mean don't plan for the future, but enjoy the life now. Because the opposite of that we saw in earlier chapters is someone who's working their fingers to the bone to get more and more and more, and then being frustrated because they're going to leave it to someone else. And they're going to lose it. They can't take it with them. He says, enjoy it while you have it. And then when you hand it over to someone, you do it as a gift. You do it as passing something down to someone else. So we come into chapter 4. We're going to look at the first the first three verses of chapter 4. He goes on because it carries the same theme. He says, "Again I saw all the oppressions that are done under the sun, and behold, the tears of the oppressed, and they had no one to comfort them. On the side of their oppressors there was power, and there was no one to comfort them." Wow, this is another negative aspect of life. There are oppressed and oppressors. Now, in our modern time, we have some political issues coming up that unnecessarily divide things up into oppressed and oppressors. And I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about the fact that there are really people in this world. There were people in Solomon's day. There are people now that will take advantage and abuse other people for their own gain. And that's exactly what he says. He said that I saw the tears of the oppressed, and they had no comforter. Had no one to comfort them. And he doesn't mean that God is not a comforter, but there was no one to give them relief from the oppression. And we have to acknowledge that that is true throughout history, and even in our modern world today. There are places in which there is great oppression going on, and there's no relief for those being oppressed. And it's a sad part of life. It is a result of human sin and human desire to dominate. And he says no one was there to comfort them. In verse 2 he says, "And I thought the dead who are already dead more fortunate than the living who are still alive." So people who are dead are better off than these people who are being oppressed. But better, in verse 3, "But better than both is he who has not yet been and has not seen the evil deeds that are done under the sun." So he says, even better than that is someone who was never born. Now once again, this strikes us as strange. But Solomon is looking at it from a standpoint of the fact that we always want a good outcome, but sometimes there's not a good outcome. Sometimes there are people who die under oppression. And there have been regimes, kingdoms, countries, and nations throughout history that to varying degrees have oppressed other people. And in most cases, those oppressed were not relieved of their oppression, other than by dying. And so that's the point he's making, is that sometimes there's no real answer, and sometimes life is very difficult. But it goes back, and these are the last verse we're going to look at, but it all goes back to this idea that he has throughout of God controlling the times. We don't control the times. We don't control the times that we may have good times. We don't control the times that we may experience bad times, or maybe even experience some form of oppression. We don't control those times. But what we do, he says, is enjoy what God has given us in the midst of the time we have. Enjoy our toil. In other words, enjoy the job God's given you. Enjoy our families. Enjoy the gifts of God. Because one day in this earth, those times will end. We will die. And those things may be also taken away from us by oppression. And in this life, that oppression may not find relief. And that is the negative thing of life. As I have said many times, this book of Ecclesiastes is very realistic. It looks at life just as it is. But I want to leave you with a positive note that Solomon keeps coming back to. God is the one who controls the times. God has put eternity into man's heart. God has made everything beautiful for its time. So therefore, enjoy the gifts that God has given for the time God has given it. Because one day they will end upon this earth. And we will go to eternity. Enjoy what God has given. I hope this is an encouragement. I know that some of this is very difficult because Solomon is so realistic, but if we really think through it, if we just look at what he says, everything he says is correct. And we've even witnessed it in our own lives. But the hope we have is that God is sovereign, God is in control, and God will always take care of his people, and we should enjoy that which God has given for the time he has given to us. Well, thank you for joining me today. I pray that God will bless you. Until next time.